Good morning. Today we finish the book of Nehemiah with chapters 12 and 13. And chapter 12 begins with the list of a listing of prophets, of priests. No, I shouldn't say prophets, of the priests. And it's and they're listed by their first name, kind of son of so and so. And I read through these because. And I've been kind of trying to read through the listings of names in the Old Testament, because I know a person that named one of her children a name that she said she found in this list in the Old Testament. And I've looked for it many times. I've never found this name. I'm not going to share anymore, but there's so many of these names that how do you pronounce them? I mean, it'd be a lot easier if they had names a lot more like ours are, but. Unfortunately for us, like David and Solomon, Elijah, and, Ezra, Nehemiah, they're not so awfully hard compared to a lot of these others. How do we say them? But it's, but for them, they were common, normal names that way. And it's just, it's a reminder for me that, our different cultures, our different nationalities, we have, different words that we use, and it's just a reminder, our English language, we got so many words that like minute and minute, spelled the same, but totally different pronunciation and meaning. But anyway, trying to figure out the pronunciation of these names, I very seldom try to pronounce them. I look at them and that's about it. But then when we get to verse 27, it talks about the dedication of the walls that are built around the city of Jerusalem, and how they dedicate them. They call the people, they bring the Levites to all their places, and it, with their songs of rejoicing and thanksgiving, with singing, with cymbals and harps and lyres, and the companies of singers, it says, gathered together from the circuit around Jerusalem and the villages, and they gather and they're led up on the walls. So these walls aren't just, narrow little things, but these walls are wide enough and thick enough that people can walk on them. And they had to be thick, heavy walls, for them to stand to begin with, and then to provide adequate safety. And, the tops of the walls continued over the tops of the gates. When the gates would open, there was still wall above them. And, and a part of the deals with the thick walls also, for the protection of the people, but also for the warriors, the guardians, to be up there during an attack. So he brings the leaders of the walls together, and they march different directions around the walls as they're singing and playing the music, and dedicating them and reminding themselves of the direction that God had given to them. So it says, the one company, appointed two great companies to give thanks, and they went in procession. One went to the right, that's in verse 31, and then to verse 38. The other company went to the left, and I followed that along with that half of the people. When it talks about going above and over the different gates of the temple as they dedicated the temple and the walls of the city to God that way. And there's again in there a listing of more names of different priests that the officials that were with, for that blessing. And in verse 42, and the singers sang with Jezariah as their leader, and they offered great sacrifices and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. The women and the children also rejoiced. It was the whole community was together in celebrating the completion of the wall, the completion of the task that had been given to them, but also the reality that as the people of God, as this chosen people of God, and under the authority of the king of Persia, they had rebuilt the city of Jerusalem and the temple to the God that they worship. And they were, had people appointed over the chambers of the stores, and, to they had big storerooms for wheat and for barley and for, the different foods and things that they needed. And people would come, we have grocery stores, we have supermarkets, we have, places where we go and get our supplies. And they had those same provisions made within the walls and within the city of Jerusalem. It's, kind of one of those things that, in so many ways, it's just kind of an afterthought for us, but for them, they needed to have places to have these provisions. And, like the tithes and the offerings that were made to the temple, they were there for for sacrifices and for official duties, but they were also there to provide for the priests, for the Levites that were there. So they had to have these storehouses that were secure. And some of those were built within the walls. Verse 46, they sang, as in the days of David and Asaph, long ago there was a leader of the singers, and there were songs of praise and thanksgiving to God. And so they were remembering and coming back to these. And some of those songs of praise would have been some of the Psalms of David. The book of Psalms, when we get to that, it's a book of songs, and many of them, and a lot of them will say to the tune of this, and so they were sung and they were repeated, and some of the Psalms we sing as well, like "Create in me a clean heart, O God." I mean, as we have in the past sung that as an offering response, and so we know those words because they're put to a melody. And that was the same way for the Jewish people, the Israelites. They knew these songs, they knew the melodies, and it helped them to remember the words of God and the words that they had come with. Chapter 13, on that day they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people. And it was found that, they shouldn't have any of these foreigners living within the walls, or entering the assembly of God, coming into the temple. And so it was to then say to these people that were there were some of them that were there living, and they had to exclude them. And starting in verse 4, the priest Eliab had, who was related to Tobiah, prepared for Tobiah this large room where he as a foreigner shouldn't have been. And so Nehemiah had returned to the king of Assyria for a time and then comes back again at the completion. So, and it talks about that, the years, it talks about that in verse 6, and that, some of this stuff happened when Nehemiah wasn't there. But when he came back, he said, we gotta do what the book of the law says, and we gotta get together, and he says, I gave orders and they cleansed the chambers, and I brought back the vessels of the house of God. And he found out that the portions, the tithes, the offerings for the Levites weren't being made properly. So he brought that back into play. And this, and then remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy was another thing that they had forgotten about. And these traders, the surrounding communities, surrounding nations would come to trade on Sunday, and they would be buying and selling. And so they closed the gates of the city, so they couldn't be coming into the city to do that. But they set up just outside of the gates, so they were still buying and selling. And so Nehemiah said, this is you got to remember the Sabbath, remember God's law. And so that too came to an end. And then the last, in verse 23, I also saw Jews who had married, these women of other nations and stuff. And it's just verse 25. Again, heartache. I contended with them and cursed them and beat some of them and pulled out their hair. And really? I mean, that's pretty serious stuff. But again, it was a reminder for them to be serious about what God's laws read and what God required of his people. I'm thankful God doesn't require, and we don't look at those requirements anymore now and stuff that way. And so the book of Nehemiah ends with Nehemiah returning to Jerusalem. reminding the people of the law and of how they should be living. And then the last few words, remember me, oh my God, for good. And it's, Jeremiah's plea to God, or his request to God, is that God would remember him for the good that he has done for the people. And I think, that's, he isn't asking for so awful many blessings, but he's saying, I've been trying to do good for the people. I've been trying to follow what you have. I've been trying to instill upon these people your law and the reasons we should follow God. And the reasons we should follow God today yet are still the same, because of his love and his grace. And he offers that grace and forgiveness to all. And that's just one of the reasons that we should know God in our hearts and minds and continue to teach and preach God and this God of love.